God. We're all here together. I'm seeing some smiling faces. That's a good thing. All right. You know how technology can discombobulate you? I'm sure you've all had this experience where things go wrong and you just, yeah, okay. Well, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to have a great session today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm glad to be here with you. I am actually in the Montreal region of Canada today, not in the usual Ottawa, just to say. We have a nice big Jewish community here in Montreal. Big happy family that we love to connect to. Actually, I'm here at my parents' house, who actually go and participate in pro-Israel rallies, and planning events with the Israeli and Jewish community in Montreal. And we're not Jewish, and yet we love the Jewish community. We get along really well with them, and they love having us included in events and things. So I thought I'd mention that because I'm here. So I like to honor what my parents do. All right, so with that, we're going to get into a really cool session. I did the reading before today. I watched Johnny's preview video. I hope all of you had the chance to do that. It's kind of a nice way to sort of prep for the discussion, reading about Isaac and the wells and Abraham having dug the wells and then the Philistines filling the wells. Yeah, Johnny, I hope I'm not stealing any of your material. I just wanted just a quick intro as we're getting into it. This is a 10-year project in the making. Welcome all of you who are online, catching this maybe after the session. Christians and Jews getting together in Canada, Africa, Israel right now. Dean won't be able to be with us today, but maybe we can get some American, maybe Jews and Christians also to join in at some point. And we all love the Hebrew Scriptures. We love the Bible, and we share that passion together. And this is part of our project, is to learn to read it together, to discuss the parts we can, and also to understand there's some theological elephants in the room, things that we don't agree upon, traditions and theologies that we wouldn't share, and we don't enforce those on each other. We don't make those central issues in our discussion of the Torah together. So that's just the culture of eNoam. It's a project we've been working on. Glad you're all here. I just want to mention we will be doing breakout rooms, Tim. I just want an agreement on that. We're going to do that today. So that's fun. We did that. We're a 1 hour session today. So we just have 1 hour. And I don't want to take any more time. So I'm ready, Johnny. I'm going to pass it on to you.
Okay, so thank you, Gabriel, and thank you for a lovely warm welcome. I hope you all had a good week. And what we're going to do is discuss a Middah, a trait of perseverance, which I've used the word amelut, which means toil, endeavor, also means perseverance. And we're going to go on a journey. Now, before we go on, I have to apologize to all those present. I asked you to look at some biblical passages, but since then, I did a little bit more homework and I've added a few more in. And so we're going to take a whistle-stop tour over a variety of biblical passages and look at a variety of rabbinic insights. And each of them is going to give us an idea and an awareness of biblical teachings about perseverance. Obviously, like every week, this is not comprehensive. There are so many verses which emphasize the value of toil and labor. Nevertheless, we want to touch on some of the central biblical verses and the central biblical themes. And with that, let's begin. And just to show you, I've added in one or two extra sources, most of which I suspect are somewhat familiar. And we're going to go on a little bit of a tour of the Bible. We're going to begin by looking at the story of Adam, Eve, pain, toil, and sweat. We're then going to make reference to a verse in the book of Job, for man is born to toil. We're going to add in the story about the birth of Noah. And at that point that we're going to do a brief breakout room. We're then going to reflect on the story of the manna in the wilderness, and then we're going to return to the story I sent in the teaser video about Isaac and the wells. And our task is to make sense of this biblical ethic, this virtue, this middah of perseverance. Let's begin with verses that we are, I presume, familiar with, verses from Genesis chapter 3, Bereshit chapter 3, describing the outcome of the sin, of the mistake, the error, however you want to translate it, of what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden, and of the consequences that were given to both of them. And here we're going to focus on the consequences, because when you pay attention to the consequences without constantly referencing the sin, these consequences seem to be teaching something separate from a mere punishment of the sin. And let's just briefly look through the verses and then pay attention to the particular words used. Both the woman Eve and the man Adam are told that there is a consequence now to their action. The woman, God said, I shall surely increase your sorrow and your pregnancy. Elisha mahar be'arbe itzvonech v'heronech be'etzev tildi banim. In pain you shall bear children. Ve'elishech shukatech v'hu yimshal bach. And to your husband you'll desire, and he will rule over you. This is what Eve is told. Verse 17, and to man, to Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife, you ate from the tree from which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground for your sake. With toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life. In Hebrew, be'itzvon tochalena kol yomei chayecha. And then the verses continue to say, and it will cause thorns and thistles to grow for you, and you shall eat the herbs of the fields with the sweat of your face. Again, we're told about this idea of effort, endeavor, perseverance. With the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for you are taken therefrom, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. Now, obviously, there are many ways to read these verses, but our focus is perseverance. And we're told about Eve that she's going to suffer pain. And at least in the translation, we're told about Adam that he's going to have to toil. He's going to have to toil in order to eat. And by the sweat of his brow, will he have to create the food to bring to the table. But I've put two words in bold in the Hebrew. You may well see it here. Be'etzev, which is translated as in pain. Be'itzavon, which is translated as with toil. And you'll notice, actually, it's the same root, ayin tzadi bet, meaning, translations often are interpretations. But in actual fact, the word about Adam is related to the word used about Eve. It says in pain to her in terms of childbirth. And in actual fact, if we were going to use that same word to Adam, it would be with greater pain. Be'itzavon is a greater emphasis on this notion of effort, endeavor, labor, toil, and pain. And this brings us to a piece of Talmud which points this out. The Talmud in Tractate Pesachim. And it says the following. Says Rabbi Yochanan, there's a task of providing a person's food. It is twice as difficult as the suffering of childbirth. How do we know this? Because the word used with reference to childbirth is be'etzev, meaning with pain, whereas the word used about toiling to provide a person's food is be'itzavon, which is actually the same word, but seemingly, there's the explanation here says itzavon is a superlative form of etzev, which indicates that it is more difficult to support oneself than to give birth. Now, given the fact that my wife we've had 5 children, the twins were cesareans, but nevertheless, I wouldn't say this too loud near her. She'd probably hit me and say, what do you know about childbirth? Nevertheless, what the rabbis are telling us is that there is a correlation between the word used with Eve and the word used with Adam. And the pain and anguish, which is described about childbirth, is further emphasized regarding the effort and the toil and the perseverance necessary to bring food to the table. And this kind of almost gives us a pyramid of effort from the beginning of the Bible. We're told certain things were going to be easy. Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden and things were easy. Then they sinned. And as a result of that, there was one level of pain called childbirth. And there's a double version of that pain called itzavon, which is what people need to do in order to have bread, have food, earn a living. And so this notion of perseverance, this notion of effort and toil is rooted in an early passage in the Bible. And it's rooted in a hierarchy of pain, anguish, and challenge, which itself teaches us about the need to persevere to give birth, shall we say, to things that matter. Now, I can see just some questions. Gabriel's asked, what's fascinating idea? Could it itavon be related to the root and persistence of slavery? Well, yeah, there's the anguish of slavery, which is a word used there in the book of Exodus. And so all these words are related. Again, when we use the English, these subtleties are lost. But when you actually look at the Hebrew, you realize we're saying to the woman X, and we're saying to the man 2X. Now, what can we learn from this other than obviously the notion of laboring and what we need to be doing, or the possibility as reference possibly of outsourcing, which certainly wasn't available in that day. What are we to learn here about the notion, the Middah of perseverance? Well, I want to refer to Rabbi David Kimchi, who was a great biblical scholar from the 12th century, who references Genesis chapter 3, verse 17. He gives some explanation based on what we're saying here. What do we derive from this whole passage about perseverance? He says, you'll have to work the soil until you'll be able finally to eat its produce. Whereas up until now, you didn't have to toil in order to assure yourself of your food supply. All you had to do was to pluck the fruit from the trees in the Garden of Eden. When the Torah had spoken of Adam's task in the Garden of Eden being to guard and to keep early on in Genesis, the amount of physical work required to attend to that task was minimal. Now he would have to work intensively, as illustrated by the metaphor, with the sweat of your brow shall you, with the sweat of your face shall you eat bread. So something shifts in Genesis chapter 3 from things being easy to things being hard, both in terms of childbirth and in terms of the general endeavor necessary to live. All of a sudden, we don't have things easy. We must toil. We must labor. We have to persevere in order to get what we want. There is a switch that's taken place in the DNA, shall we say, of subsistence in the world. Now things aren't given to us. We now need to earn them. And we have to work hard with the sweat of your face shall you eat bread, which is really the biblical description of what is perseverance. It won't come easy. And the question really is, what are we to do with that new reality? Is it won't come easy now a blessing or a curse? Well, based on what we're reading here, it seems to be a curse. A consequence of eating from the garden means that Eve is told that she will suffer etzev, and Adam is told that he will suffer itzavon. And it seems that this is a direct consequence. This is an onesh. This is a punishment. Maybe it was then. But as we're going to see, this new reality became really essential. In fact, though it may well have been that a sin prompted this new mode of being, this new mode of being now has virtues. Why so? Because when you persevere and you acquire something and you achieve something, you feel accomplished. When it comes easy to you, you don't. So though the switch from the Garden of Eden modality to the post-Garden of Eden seems to be a descent, and this being a punishment, from now on, there is a new rule in the world, shall we say. In order to get things, you have to work. In order to achieve things, you have to persevere. Any quick questions before we go on about this passage or the way I've perhaps read it? And you see, we're trying to look at Genesis 3 slightly differently, less as a punishment, more as a new reality, which, though it may have come from something negative, is now a new way of being. And this instruction to Adam, with the sweat of your face shall you eat bread, is a necessary way for him to exist. Similarly, with Eve, this pain, the etzer that she will experience, is a necessary way for life to be born. This effort, this toil, this perseverance is required for success in the world. No longer will things come easily. And in fact, what we're going to then show is when things seem to be coming easily, that's where mistakes begin. Okay. So if there are no queries right now, let's briefly move on. And we're now going to look at a text we're familiar with. We're now going to look at a text that I previously listed, and then one which we're familiar with, which I hadn't listed. You know, interesting, the rabbis often draw various ethical associations between the story of Genesis and the book of Job. Sometimes interesting how they find parallels between one biblical book and another. We see similar words used towards Adam and Eve in the book of Job. And here we're told as a reality in the book of Job, for man is born to toil. Ki Adam la'amal yualad. And on this Malbim, Levush Malbim, who lived in the 19th century, he says this is like a klal, this is a rule in the way of being. At the end of the day, he says, the essence of a man's success depends on his effort, perseverance, and hard work. And you can hear it in this commentary, almost an affirmation of what we heard in Genesis chapter 3. True, perhaps beforehand things came easily, but now mankind is decreed to effort and labor. This is the only way forward to achieve the goals you want. Says the book of Job, for man is born to toil, as if to say, the new person who's not born in the Garden of Eden, but the one born outside the Garden of Eden, this is now their task. And as Malbim, many other commentaries, he just says it really nicely. He says, this is the essence, this is our task, this is our mission, to endeavor, to persevere, and to work hard. So from the moment we left the Garden of Eden, we shouldn't have presumed, and we shouldn't presume that things will come easily. Instead, we should expect to have to work hard. We should expect to have to persevere. So far, so good? Oh.
Good.
So is there a query? Feel free to interrupt at any time.
Yeah, good so far.
I feel like this could go very deep. It take a lot of, I don't know, time to unpack some of these things.
Well, they are deep. This is dealing with, shall we
yeah.
say, how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to live. What are the expectations of humanity?
I was just, yeah. I mean, I have ideas. I don't know if we want to get into them now and maybe just get through your section and then we can.
Okay, so let's see how things then proceed, not in terms of our learning, but in terms of the Bible. So far what we said is there's a Garden of Eden reality of things basically being easy, and then the consequence of the sin in the Garden of Eden where things are going to be difficult. And here the book of Job basically says from then on, that was a new modus operandi. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to a verse that I didn't put in the teaser, but I do want us to ponder now. It's one which is quite curious, actually, and it relates to the birth of Noah in the book of Genesis chapter 5. And here we're told, and Lamech lived 182 years, and he begot a son. And what was the son called? V'yikrat shmo Noach, and his name was called Noah. Lemor, saying, meaning this is why he was called this, Ze yinachamenu mima'asenu umi'itzvon yadenu min ha'adama asher erara Hashem. This one will give us rest or comfort, possibly, from our work and from the itzvon. Now, can you see, and I probably should use an annotation, this Hebrew word itzvon is a very same word used with respect to Adam. In fact, it's a very same root used with respect to Eve. Here we're told Noach, is going to give us rest from our work and from the itzvon, this double anguish that has been directed towards the ground, which God has cursed. And this is where I'd like us to actually do our breakout rooms. I want to ask a very simple question. What can we learn from the meaning of Noah's name? And of course, the usage of this word, itzvon, meaning toil, which is an echo. It is a hyperlink to that earlier story in Genesis chapter 3, referring to the exit, or really referring to the being eviction from the Garden of Eden. What can we learn from the meaning of Noah's name in terms of perseverance? So that's going to be actually our question for the breakout room, which I don't think requires more than necessarily about 5 minutes. But just to say it one more time clearly, what we saw, and I'll just go back beforehand so that everything is crystal clear. We saw that Adam and Eve were both given consequences from their actions. The Hebrew word etzev, meaning pain or toil, is used with respect to both. With Eve, it's etzev. With Adam, it's itzavon. And the rabbis say this shows that his punishment is double her punishment. And here we're told by Radak, which is, again, just one of the great biblical commentaries we have, that before these events, things were easy. You could get food from the garden. But now the task of humanity is to labor. And we see that in the instruction, with the sweat of your face, you shall eat bread. We see in the book of Job that now the task is for humanity to toil. And at the end of the day, this is what we need to do. It requires our effort, our perseverance, and our hard work. And then 2 chapters later, Noah is born. According to the rabbis, Noah is born 10 generations after Adam. You can count it there yourself, actually. So 10 generations afterwards, Noah is born. And we are told that he's going to be some kind of comfort or provide some kind of rest from this very toil, which is reflected and which is cursed and which is a consequence to Adam and Eve. And so my question is, what is really going on in Genesis, in Bereshit chapter 5, verse 29? What is expected of Noah? What do we learn from his name in terms of the plan for the future? What is God telling us here about this new biblical personality and perhaps an expected change in the way the world is meant to be? Any quick questions before we do our breakout rooms?
Maybe for the good of anyone, like, so Noach, the name in Hebrew, like I can see right away in the root, Yenechamenu, right? So that root is connected to the
That's right.
rest
Noach means
from our
is a name, and Nachamenu it seemingly is will comfort us or will give us rest.
and it's the root of comfort, right? The same root. That's the kind of the Hebrew.
Yeah, that's whether it's comfort will give it rest is it actually a matter of debate, but nevertheless, it's something to do with one of those two things.
It could also, instead of the saying comfort, it could also be consolation, which I think has nuanced difference, but that's worth thinking about.
That's 100%.
Great. Yeah, I brought it up because I thought it would bring more food to the discussion.
Perfect. I appreciate it.
Okay.
So this doesn't require too long, I think. I'd just like to hear people's kind of almost knee-jerk reactions, but it's good to always schmooze together, chat together. So we'll take 5 minutes and discuss this question. Most of us are familiar with Genesis 5:29 and what is really going on here in terms of what we've seen previously with Adam and Eve and what we understand in terms of the expectation now that man is to be toiling. Is mankind going to be toiling if we hope that Noah somehow reduces or removes the itzavon? I would like to share my screen once again and ask the question. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then we're going to review a possible different idea, depending on what you have to say about it, about this question. So I'll say it slightly differently. If we were to read this verse literally, it would seem that Noah is almost repairing the curse that was placed on the ground through the consequence of Adam's sin, that he is able to alleviate this itzvon, this double toil that Adam was tasked with carrying as a result of his transgression. It looks like Noah has been given the key to, shall we say, fix the problem that the ancestor Adam had created. But maybe I've read it wrong. So, what are your thoughts about this verse? Anybody with any thoughts you'd like to share? No pressure.
Yeah.
I'd like to make Gabriel our spokesman. Thank you.
Sorry, Johnny, are you looking for the group's feedback?
Whatever, anybody, I'm not telling people how to do things. You know, nobody tells a good jazz player how to play his music.
Okay,
You know, when
well,
we read the Bible, we all hear things in our own unique way. So if you've got things to share, I'd love to hear it.
well, okay, I can step into the silence here for our group. Just our quick discussion. There was a little dark opening that both Ruth and I, when we saw this, you know, he will give us rest. We both thought, well, they're all going to be dead soon. So Noah and his sons are the only ones who are going to be carrying forward. So they will have rest in that sense. That's the dark option. Maybe, you know, if those of us have a dark sense of humor. But the other side would be, you know, that in his generation, he actually did play a role of a prophet who was speaking about an option to turn away from what was going wrong in their generation and to, you know, to embrace what he was receiving from God as a solution. And he wasn't received as a prophet. And then, you know, Dina brought up that it seems like when he was young, though, when he was a child, they somehow acknowledged that he was going to be playing a role of giving them rest. And yet later, they didn't necessarily embrace that role. There seemed to be this tension that came there. And then Dina also brought in this other thought about some kind of a complication with respect to having children, and that there was, you know, that was somehow maybe connected to Noah's name. Or Dina, I hope I did honor to your comment there.
Well, that sounds like you guys had a great and rich conversation and looked at the verse from a variety of perspectives.
I just thought maybe his birth, maybe Noah's birth was unusual. Maybe people stopped having children in his time. There was something about his birth, that just the fact that he was born, that seemed to have struck them all.
So that could be.
I think
there is something. There's no question about that.
I also brought in this idea that the itzavon that we see, the pain and the toil, is really seems to be a result of what happened with the serpent. And the serpent introduced into the world this paradigm of there being a competition between God and man, and between man and man. Everybody's competing in competition. It's a zero-sum game. And basically, if everybody's competing, life becomes much more difficult because you have to protect yourself from God and you have to protect yourself from other people. Noah seems to bring in a new paradigm. Perhaps there's even something about his continence when he's born that seems to say, I am at peace with God. I want to live in partnership with God, and that enables going back perhaps to the existence that mankind enjoyed when they were in the Garden of Eden before this zero-sum game became part of their thinking. Unfortunately, the people in this generation didn't buy into this new paradigm, and perhaps in our generation as well, we see that it's difficult for people to buy in. People tend to feel threatened and to always be defensive and to protect themselves. But perhaps God is really trying to encourage us into a different kind of relationship with God and with others.
Okay, so that's some beautiful ideas, rich ideas, and original ideas there. And thank you for sharing. Anybody else before we move on?
Jonathan and Kim both have ideas here.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll say one thing. When I read this verse, I think my focus, at least, is on us. Give us rest, right? Who is this us? Meaning, I think this us is humanity, right? Humankind. And it's not like for like his family or right. So Noah is kind of like the new father of humankind, right? After the flood, right? His family is the first family. And I think maybe, we know that Noah was a righteous man. So maybe by him, being righteous and, hopefully he will raise, a family of righteous people. We are kind of reversing the curse. We are starting from the beginning again with a righteous family who will not do something against God. And so the curse will be reversed in a way.
Right. I mean, again, there is a sentiment that somehow God is almost trying once more with somebody while removing or reducing or possibly quashing that curse that had been given to the world through the actions of Adam. 100%. Kim, you wanted to add something?
Our group, Beatrice noted that she noted the fact that we had a cycle and the judgment that was coming at the end of the cycle, and then that bringing us into a place of starting again and potentially a place of rest. David noted that even, Hashem says at the very end, he says, I will never destroy man like this through flood again. So that something has shifted even with God, and that it does bring this sense of peace and rest. And then we talked about
Although don't forget, this happens before the flood. The flood is Genesis 6. This is 5.
Yes, but we were talking about after the flood.
Right, I understand.
And then also, and I wish I had notes, but each one of the names from Adam all the way to Noah have a definition that actually tells this story of redemption, which is extremely interesting. But I actually said that the thing about Noah's name, that this one, just like the names are very prophetic, they tell the story not only in the present, but also for the future. And we've already talked about or mentioned the entering in of the ark and these incidences. But Noah is the father of Shem, Ham, and Yafet. And there is a problem on the other side of the flood with Ham, and there is a problem. But through Shem, we would come to Avraham, and through Avraham, we would begin the whole process of redemption that would ultimately bring Hashem to say to Israel, when you come out of Egypt, you're coming back into a land that you're not going to have to build houses. You're not going to have to do these very things that have been, the plight of everything since I sent Abraham to the land. It's been difficult, as we're going to see with Isaac's well. So this was our, little discussion on this subject.
That sounds wasn't so little. I'm aware of time, but I want to turn to Francis, and then we'll try and make progress in terms of building a certain picture. We may finish a little bit after the hour, but I still want to be somewhat close up. Francis, you wanted to say something? Sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Solomon. It's great to be back. I've been away for such a long time because of my engagement.
Congratulations.
But I agree with his name was a prophetic pronouncement that I believe was to offer hope of redemption from the consequences of sin that occurred in the garden and eventual restoration back to what God had intended before. And almost in every culture and belief, including my own culture in Africa, names are very important in offering hope. So this was a kind of prophetic pronouncement, I believe, and it's demonstrated in his life that every time God is doing work of restoration back to his original intention, there is a form of judgment that comes. And so God had to judge the earth by the flood, but it was incumbent on Noah to exemplify the picture of redemption that God intended to do. And so after him, then humanity began to populate the earth again. So I believe the name was a prophetic proclamation of the hope of redemption and restoration back to God's intent. Thank you.
So thank you. That's a very, very beautiful, beautiful insight. And in fact, I'd like to take that and move it forward. And I'd like to share with you one of the many rabbinic interpretations of this verse. As you know, the rabbis often used to give many, many different approaches to the Bible in terms of their creative interpretive spirit. I'm going to share one of them, and this is cited by the classic biblical commentator called Rashi. And Rashi says something which perhaps may surprise some of you, but it's actually very much consonant with what Francis just said. He says the following: this one will give us rest. Why? He will give us rest from the toil of our hands, because before Noah came, they didn't have plowshares, and he prepared these tools for them. And the land was producing thorns and thistles when they sowed wheat, because of the curse of the first man, Adam. But in Noah's time, the curse subsided. Now, this is a brief expression of one of the many different rabbinic interpretations, but they suggest that when it says Noah was going to bring rest for the work of the toil of the hands, it means that he was an innovator. He was somebody who was good with his hands and actually created some tools. We know that he's good with his hands because later on he builds an enormous ark. And he comes up with a few tools that make digging the hard ground easier, that make sowing the seeds easier, that make the toil that Adam and the subsequent generations had experienced that much more relieved. And people say about this man Noah, oh, he's given us some kind of rest, some kind of relief from that pain, that anguish that we've suffered from the time of Adam, the itzvon, in terms of how we plant and grow things in the ground. Now, I want you to hold on to this thought. We could discuss the meaning of this teaching for many, many hours. I'm asking us not to, but I want you to reflect on what happens next. It seems that Noah is giving people relief. The world will now be easier. It's almost being restored, as Francis said, to life in the Garden of Eden, where things weren't so hard to achieve. Maybe not quite the same as the Garden of Eden, but nevertheless not as bad and not as harsh as it was with Adam and subsequent generations. But then soon after, notwithstanding the world being blessed with an easier way of doing things, with life giving them greater time to reflect because they weren't having to work so hard, the world descends. We know in the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, we're told how the people committed crimes, which are interpreted to mean that they stole from one another. Why? Why would a society which has now got it better than any other go down to such lows in terms of moral behavior and spiritual behavior? Why is it when life is getting better, the moral life is getting worse? And this leads me to want to share something stunning from one of my teachers, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. I'm aware of time, so we're probably not going to read it all. But this insight is going to be fundamental to how we now look at a few subsequent biblical passages. It's not a biblical commentary in which I'm quoting. He wrote one, but this isn't one of them. This is an essay that I read some years ago in a book called Future Tense. And here Rabbi Sachs says something so profound that it's certainly worthy of sharing it. I'll briefly summarize some of this because we've got one further slide from his writings. And he says the following, oftentimes we think that the reason why many Jews and other people of other faith leave faith is because faith is hard, is because the observances of faith are difficult. And as a result of that, often there is an urge to lower the bar and make faith practices easier. Make how you can live a Jewish life or a life of any other faith one which is less demanding. Now I'm going to jump to this point, although you can look at this. I'll gladly send this to you afterwards. He says, all that sounds eminently reasonable. The only problem is that it's untrue and misconceived. Consider the three pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. He asks, which amongst the contemporary Jewish world is most observed? The answer is Passover, even though that is technically the hardest of the festivals. One has to clean their house of all leaven. And he says, what's interesting also is, when you look at the other festivals of the Jewish year, the one festival that almost everybody keeps is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, even though that requires a person to fast for 24 hours, right? Which is a really hard thing to do. And Rabbi Sachs wonders, why is it that the two festivals where even the least observant Jews keep are the two hardest? He says a profound idea. He says, if all this is correct, it explains why for 2 centuries Jews have pursued policies that seem to make sense but are destined to yield a result precisely the reverse of that expected. Listen carefully. The easier the religion, the less it will be observed. The explanation lies in Leon Festinger's famous discovery known as cognitive dissonance. One corollary of this theory is that we value most what costs us the most. The more demanding the task, the greater commitment it evokes. That can be seen to be true today, not only within Judaism, but also the other faiths of the world. We value most for that which we make sacrifices. And he goes on to say, Judaism survived 2,000 years of exile, not because it was easy, but because it was difficult, sometimes heartbreakingly so. It is normally assumed that Jews made sacrifices for their faith because they valued it. The opposite may also be true. Jews valued their faith because they made sacrifices for it. I'm going to pause here only because of time, but what he writes is fascinating. And let me now explain to you why this insight is so resonant to our story. What have we said? Adam was given everything on a plate. He didn't have to work hard, but messed up. And God then exiles Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, says you're going to have to work hard. Now that may sound like a punishment, but actually this is a new mode of the world. God says, I don't want people to have things easy. I want things to be hard because people value what they work to achieve. 10 generations, things are hard. Most people live a relatively moral life. Noah comes along and makes life easy. What happens? World descends into chaos, such that God sends a flood. The moment life becomes easy is when grave moral mistakes are made. And let me show you one further proof of this. One further proof of this is what happens when the Israelites leave Egypt and go through the wilderness. And you'll remember that they complain about food, and eventually God gives them manna, the manna from heaven. And there's a very curious verse in Exodus chapter 16, verse 4. It says here at the bottom, so the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm going to rain down for you bread from heaven, and the people shall go out and gather what is needed for the day, so that I can test them whether or not they will follow my teaching. And the rabbis query, they say, what is the association between the receiving of manna and the test? And I'd like to share with you one very beautiful explanation by Or HaChaim, Chaim ibn Attar, a 17th, 18th century biblical commentator. He says the following: until this point, the Israelites have had to labor. Now they're in the wilderness, and God has promised he's going to give them everything without effort. The manna is going to come from heaven. The water's going to come from the well. Their clothes are not going to wear, their shoes are not going to wear. And God says, I'm going to test you. Can you handle a life where you don't have to labor for what you have? Think about it. It's actually a third attempt almost to go back to the Garden of Eden experience. There's a Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and then they're exiled. Then there's Noah, who apparently is going to relieve the anguish that it's on. But then actually, people abuse the easy life, and it leads them to moral chaos. Now the Israelites are in the wilderness, and God says, I'm going to give you everything. Let's see if you can handle affluenza, this blessing of affluence, this giving of everything that you need without effort. And as we know, for much of the 40 years of their wandering, they complain. They rebel. Isn't that crazy? But then we go back to the insight of Rabbi Sachs and we realize it's when you give people things for free, when they don't work hard for it, when they don't persevere, that's when mistakes happen. We think perseverance is a punishment for the sin. In fact, perseverance was a reality based on the fact that when you're in the Garden of Eden and you don't persevere, you abuse the blessings God has given you. And that's what happened. Prior to the time of the flood, they were gifted technologies that made their life easier. But did they use their time well, or did they use their time poorly? Here in the time of the wilderness, they were given food from heaven. Did they use their time well, or did they complain and find fault even with the blessings they had? In fact, when we think about what is told to Adam and Eve, the pain of childbirth and the double pain of having to, earn bread, though that sounds terrible, that's the tool to valuing what we have. Because when we don't have to work, we've seen time and again in the Bible that a lack of perseverance leads to a rebellion towards God. A lack of effort leads to taking things for granted. Whenever God gives to the people without their effort, they show a disregard and disrespect and a disdain. Now, let's return to that story that we did include in the teaser. We have a very strange and lengthy series of verses in Genesis chapter 26. The rabbis often say that the Bible isn't verbose, it doesn't speak unnecessarily about seemingly timely matters, it only teaches us timeless matters, and often then with certain brevity. And yet there are many verses here telling about the toing and froing of the wells, which Isaac expected to be there, which his father had dug, which weren't there. And then he and those working with him have to redig, and there are conflicts and there are frictions about wells. And so he goes one place and goes another place and he goes another place. And it's somewhat of a repetitive story, somewhat almost of a tiresome story. Okay, so there wasn't a well and he went. You sometimes wonder, what's the message of this story? What's the message of one of the great patriarchs having to work hard and redig and have quarrels about wells that were already dug, which were then refilled by the Philistines? And then you reflect on the insight I shared with you of the great sage Yisrael Meir Kagan, a great holy 19th century Torah scholar. And he says, I'll tell you what I think this story is all about. This story is a story of the Bible. It's a story of Job in chapter 5, verse 7. It's a story of how to succeed with labor. You dig, and sometimes things get closed up, and then you dig and you dig. Because if you think success comes to people without their effort, you don't understand our mission in life. You don't understand that perseverance, though initially seemingly as a curse to Adam and Eve, became a tool to material and spiritual success. And anytime we weren't asked to persevere, that's where we fell, that's where we erred. And when you think about the comments of Rabbi Sachs, every festival that requires the greatest perseverance, those are the ones we value the most, because it's what we work hard for is what we value the most. And so says Israel Meir Kagan, this is the way with all things, material and spiritual, business matters and Torah study. That is, it takes effort, it takes labor, it takes endeavor, and it takes perseverance. And the fact you have biblical patriarchs digging and digging and digging, they're showing us how to live our life, to dig and to dig and to dig, and to not expect things to come easily. This is the way of all things. This is both in terms of business and Torah study. You have to work hard. Don't think that you would be worthy of living in the time of the Garden of Eden, where things would be given to you. In fact, ironically, it's from the moment we exile the Garden of Eden, that modality would be a curse, not a blessing. Because anytime we've tried to go back to that modality, it has been a curse, not a blessing. As mentioned with Noah, and similarly as mentioned in times of the journey in the wilderness, where the manna came from heaven and the water was provided, and still they complained again and again and again. But in the teaser video, and this we're going to conclude with, I did ask you one further question. What can we learn from the symbolism of a well of water? Why don't we learn about perseverance from the fact that the patriarchs and matriarchs had to travel very far? Why don't we learn about perseverance because of the endeavor they made in terms of wars? Abraham had to fight wars in the region. Why did Israel Meir Kagan speaks about the wells as being a symbol of perseverance? The well as being representative of that rule of thumb taught to us by Job, that mankind is due to toil. If you'd like to share your thoughts, I'd love to hear them, and perhaps then I'll quickly share mine. Anybody with any ideas about why wells are used, why the symbol of water is used to represent this idea of toil and endeavor?
I can tell you that in recent years, we have two grandchildren who were given the name Be'er and Be'eri, which are wells. Maybe that's a session, that's a suggestion that we, each of us, is really a well of spirituality, of water, which brings life. We are all life-giving forms that for us to recognize that special life-giving gifts that we've been given, we really have to dig well into ourselves, and we have to do so very well, as Jenna says.
Right, I think that's a very beautiful idea, and my ideas were going to be quite similar to those. Anybody else with some thoughts before we wrap up? So let me briefly tell you my thoughts. The rabbis, actually based on the story of the Israelites' journey from Egypt, derived that water is often used as a metaphor for Torah, for the Bible, for the Word of God. They talk about how absent of water we are parched, and with water we are sustained. Water is considered to be representative of spirituality. And so the idea of digging for water, I think, represents a need to dig sometimes in our biblical texts, make sense of them. The idea of water also means that sometimes you have to dig deeper than you planned. And you reach there when you're able to fill your mouth and to give to others as well. So why do we learn perseverance from the well with relation to Abraham and specifically Isaac in this case? It's to teach us that though we persevere with many things, we persevere in terms of our material world. And that's really how the Bible begins, with Adam and how he needs to toil for his bread. And that's how we saw the rabbis even referring to Noah, who's going to make people's life easier, and the ground will will be easier to sow and the bread will be easier to grow. So all that refers to materialism. And even though with the Israelites in the wilderness, they're referring to bread and water, physical things. Nevertheless, what water also represents is spiritual things. And too many of us, sometimes we put endeavor for our material world, but lack endeavor for our spiritual world, of course, not present company included. We put in the effort for the things which seemingly matter, the physical things around us, the material things, but we're often quite lax. We take shortcuts for spirituality. You know, there'll be people who will spend months building a car. They'll spend years planning an extension to their house. But if they may come to me as a religious person, they say, I tried to pray for 2 minutes and it just didn't work. I'm thinking, excuse me? You're prepared to spend months for building this and years building that, and you gave prayer 2 minutes? Let me tell you, water, which represents spirituality, takes endeavor as well. And so that's what I derive from this teaching of the Ep.18, Yisrael Mer Kagan, as he says. This is the rule, both for material things, but also spiritual things. We need to dig, and we need to dig and dig. And when we put in effort and endeavor, after the right amount of effort and the right amount of endeavor, when we persevere, then it can bear fruit, and we truly are sustained. So I think that's pretty much me. I'm just going to check the chat box. As Camilla says, wells are dug deep. Water represents the word of God. It washes us as we read it and cleanse us. Absolutely. That's exactly what I was saying. And thank you for saying it with such beautiful words.
Johnny, can I add something? So 2 things. First of all, I think it's very interesting you said that the water represents spirituality. And the generation of Noah was destroyed by water because they lack spirituality. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, from the beginning of the class, I thought a lot about Yair's shiur, I think 4 or 5 weeks ago, regarding Shemitah. And in a way, I think the Shemitah is kind of coming to reverse the situation. It forces us, to save during the years pre-Shemitah. So during the year of Shemitah, like the curse is not upon us, and we can live in a more spirituality way, as in Eden, pre the sin.
That's beautiful. Well, that's the point. If you let the land grow on its own, it doesn't require so much labor. So you're right. There is this connection of it being the 7th year and the 7th day in the Sabbath of the land, this higher level experience. So thank you for sharing that, Yonat.
And Yair, I just want to throw in an idea in response to Yonatan's idea, where, Yonatan, you just mentioned the idea that the flood came because there wasn't enough spirituality. So I learned from my Jewish friends, that sometimes you can clash ideas in a Bible study. They can be in opposing views. So I want to just throw out the idea that what if it's the opposite? What if it's that the flood represents uncontrolled spirituality that is it's chaos. There's too much of it. There's not enough focus, and there's not enough it's like energy needs to be directed in order for it to be productive. Like water is always destructive when it's out of control. And I know that there are some traditions, I actually brought this up in our small group, there are some traditions that talk about the events that happened before the flood being about interactions between the people and spiritual forces that were not correct, were not healthy, were not good for humanity. And that they could have been an excess of spiritual interaction that was not according to our creator's intention and design. Just a different idea. I want to throw out one more idea about the wells. Sorry, Yair, I don't want to hold you up. I thought this was a really good idea. Is that when it's really good, when you start digging a well, you need water. Knowing you need water is the first step. The second step is to start working on digging a well. But here's the problem. Sometimes you dig a well in the wrong spot and you have to stop. You have to move to another spot and you have to start digging again. But the problem is, if the water's at 10 feet and you stop at 9 feet, you just dug 9 feet and you never got to water. And so there's a bit of a mystery to this, where it's a bit of a cruel reality, is that you might know you need water, you might be searching for water, but you might just be a foot away. And sometimes you have to persevere that one more foot, 10 feet, boom, the water comes, you get the result. But in another place, you need to stop and move on to another location. So it does represent a bit of the complexity of it.
I just want to build on what you said, because it's really, it follows from this, perhaps what we see in Numbers 21:18. And Numbers 21:18 is very unique in that it's the first time that we actually see the entire nation singing together, coming from them, not Moshe leading them, but they sing on their own. And what is the first verse that they sing about? Be'er Chafua Sarim, the well that was dug by the ministers or the leadership or by the people. And I really feel that one of the things about digging wells is that it really requires a collective effort. You really need a collective effort. You need everybody working together. And when everybody works together in order to achieve that, to bring water, which is so necessary to everyone, then it's not just a success that brings water, it's a success that brings celebration to everyone because of this collective effort that was made and yielded the fruit of that labor. So I think that the collective aspect is very, very there also with Isaac and the Plishtim. Here we are in a situation which we live every day here in Israel. We are digging the wells of our forefathers, and we're finding that it's not always welcomed by the other people that are in this region, right? And they hate us, and they do all kinds of crazy things. But it's through our perseverance that it appears that ultimately we will reach a place where they will come to us and will say, we want peace with you. And when we come, so we have to realize that it's our perseverance that will ultimately bring about not just togetherness within the Jewish people, but togetherness also with our neighbors.
Beautiful.
Great.
Beautiful.
So we are 12 minutes past the hour here. We went a little bit long, but it's a good long. Kim, I don't see you on my screen there. There you are in the corner. All right, so I think we're good to wrap up today. Unless anyone has any closing last thoughts, if there's something you got that you want to give the group, please, now's your chance. You have 30 seconds.
I just want to
Francis's hand is up.
My hand was up.
All right, let's do Kim first and then Francis after, okay?
There he is. I just wanted to say that the scripture also says that the Lord himself is the fountain of living waters. So in Jeremiah, it does say, which comes with that, the whole thing we've been talking, because they have forsaken Hashem, the fountain of living waters. So I think that just kind of encapsulates everything that we talked about concerning toil and spirituality. Francis, that's all.
Thank you so much, Kim. You've just read the portion of scripture I wanted to read.
Sorry, Francis.
Interesting.
That's synchronicity.
Let me just read it as it is. Let me just read it as it is. I'll read from verse 11 to 14, Jeremiah chapter 2.
Oh, I was reading.
It says, has a nation changed their gods, which are yet no gods? But my people have changed. Be astonished, O ye heavens, at this, and be horribly afraid. Be ye very desolate, says the Lord. For my people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. Is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave? Why is he spoiled? Now, the Lord claims he is the fountain of life. And I see from Jeremiah's words here, one of the reasons why Judah went into captivity is that they had changed the source of life and sustenance, both the spiritual source and the material source, drawn their trust and focus away from Hashem and put it in other things. And that, I believe, is one of the reasons why they were taken into captivity. So a lesson for us to adhere to him as the only source of life and sustenance, both spiritual life and material life. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. I guess we can all go back to work with positive expectations that all that toiling is going to yield a good result now.
There you go.
So, Shavua Tov, everybody. Have a great week, and we will be back together. We'll be in touch by
Bye-bye.
email.
Thank you, Rabbi
Thank you.
Johnny. It was excellent. Thank you.
Pleasure. Look after yourselves. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to your feedback in our follow-up email with the replay.
And
Thank you.
welcome back, all of you who have rejoined us after a while. We really look forward to so many
Thank you.
sessions.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We really missed you too. Really missed you. Thank you, everyone.
Good to see your face, Francis.
My pleasure always. And,
Mazal tov, as we say, Mazal tov, Francis.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Yaya. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everyone. God bless you.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Camille. All right.